Thank you all for joining us for the Implicit Bias Training for Leaders workshop. Joining us today are Dr. Jennifer Reynolds, Professor Psychological and Brain Science Program Coordinator, and Dr. Paul Nelson, Associate Professor in Residence Department of Psychology. They are going to discuss unconscious bias and identify the impact of unconscious bias in the workplace. I'm going to hand it over to them to get started.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Pardis. I am Jennifer Reynolds, and I'm going to be starting off the talk, and then I'll be handing it over to my colleague, Paul Nelson. So let me get started here. I should just say I'm a developmental psychologist who studies face perception and processing and the development of stereotypes and biases. So I take a developmental perspective to a lot of my work, but that's not necessarily the approach I'll be doing today. So what I'm hoping to do today is kind of talk about what bias is in general and the difference between implicit and explicit bias, why we have these biases, how they can impact individuals in the workplace, and why it's really important to be aware of these biases and promote diverse environments, and then end with some suggestions to decrease bias in the workplace. So before we really get into biases, I just want to go over some definitions because bias, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination are all related concepts, but they are different from one another, and I want to make sure that I can differentiate those for you. So when you're showing bias, it's a tendency that you evaluate one social group more favorably than another, and this typically means that there are positive and or negative associations with particular groups. With stereotypes, we're getting more into cognitive beliefs regarding a social group's characteristics. And these can affect how we process information about others. And then when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about an attitude that helps to create or maintain these hierarchical status relations between groups. And these can have both affective, cognitive, and behavioral components, and they pretty much function to preserve a group's dominant status. And then when we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about biased behavior toward a group and its various members. And this can affect how we evaluate them, the resources that are allocated, and it often more reflects in-group favoritism as opposed to like overtly negative associations to outgroups. But that can occur when outgroups are associated with really strong emotions such as fear, hatred, or disgust. And I want to note that these can happen at the individual level. So just during individual interactions with others. These can happen at the institutional level in terms of formal laws or policies, or they can happen at the cultural level, where we have one group who exerts their power to define the values for society, and it tends to privilege that culture and heritage and the values of the dominant group. And it imposes this culture then on less dominant groups. And when we talk about groups, we're talking about various different social cues and identities. And this is not an all-inclusive list, but these are a lot of the attributes that result in individuals being grouped and bias being directed toward them based on their group membership. And so I just, again, want to just give you an idea of like what we're talking about when we're talking about social groups here. Okay. So we just talked about bias, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So which one is the first example? Asian Americans are hardworking. Feel free to type in the chat if you think that's bias, stereotype, prejudice, or discrimination. Stereotype, yes. It's a cognitive belief. And even though this is maybe a positive stereotype, it also can be limiting. So for example, I was at a conference and someone mentioned because Asian Americans are hardworking, they're often not considered as a possible candidate for presidency, for example. How about an employee avoids interacting with his Latina coworker? this is actually discrimination because it's sort of this behavioral that's going on, even though it's avoiding a behavior, because it's behavioral. Discrimination is the best fit for this one. What about thinking favorably of women? Yes, bias is the right one there, where you have like a positive or negative association. And again, though, if you think favorably of women as helpful and kind, that can be a nice attribute, except when you're actually trying to evaluate them for a powerful leadership role. And then how about the last one? An executive thinks only white men should be in managerial positions. This one's prejudice. Great, thank you. So just to kind of give you an idea then of just different ways that these can manifest. So let's now distinguish between explicit versus implicit bias. So explicit biases are beliefs that people actually know that they hold. We're aware of them. And because we're aware of them, we can control them. So we can choose to express our biases and attitudes, or we can choose not to. But with implicit biases, these tend to be associations that occur automatically and often without the person knowing it's happening. So there's this lack of awareness. There's this unintentional activation. And despite the fact that we aren't really aware of it and it's unintentionally activated, it can reliably predict our behaviors, often independently from our explicit attitudes. It can affect our understanding of a situation, the actions we take, and the decisions we make, often in a very unconscious manner. Now, that's not to say that these are always fully unconscious, but most of the time they're out of our awareness because they happen just because of these automatic associations. And if you have like a positive implicit association, it tends to be then associated with other positive attributes. So if you think beauty is good and you see a beautiful person, you might tend to think that they're also a nice person, that they treat others well. And so there can be sort of these associations that transfer over. And what's interesting, though, is the information that we get can affect how we recall it later. So there was a study done where they just had a person go into a classroom and talk to the students in there, and the person was either introduced as a student, as a lecturer, or a professor. And later on, they had to recall that individual with several things, but one of the things they also asked was how tall the individual was. And everyone recalled the individual who was named as a professor as being taller than the individual who was named as a student, despite it being the exact same person. So this is just one way that our implicit associations can impact how we think about individuals, remember them, and recall information. Now, with explicit bias, this is where we make explicit statements. And here we can see on the left, we have two individuals from the same group. In this case, there are supposed to be two males. And a comment gets directed to the individual when they're an in-group member, like, oh, you're not doing so well in this problem, you suck at math. But then we have who's supposed to be a male and female in this picture, and the individual is not doing well at math, but instead of saying you suck at math, they say girls suck at math. So that in this case, it's getting extended to an entire group when the person's an out-group member. With implicit bias, this is just, again, this unconscious activation that can occur. Now, in this scenario, we have an individual, a man interviewing a woman for a position, and there's just this activation of feminine stereotypes, or what we refer to as communal traits. So women are thought to be warm to others, helpful, gentle, emotional, devoted to others, kind, understanding, all these sort of positive feminine associations. And again, these are positive attributes. But if you are applying for a managerial role that requires you to be more independent, self-confident, competitive, standing up under pressure, active, making decisions easily, which are agentic traits and are often masculine positive associations, this can hinder the chances of being hired because the individual is thinking of you in a different way because of this implicit feminine bias. Now you might be wondering, you're telling me that we're unaware and unconscious of our implicit bias, so how do we actually know people have implicit bias? So a lot of the research that's been conducted in this field uses something called the implicit association task. And here, the participants in these studies, their job is to sort words or faces. And one of the goals is to see like how quickly they can sort these words or faces. So for example, up here, we have female and career on the left-hand side and male and family on the right-hand side. Because female and career don't go as well together as female and family and male and career, when they have to sort salary, they might take longer to decide if they're going to career or male, if they have that masculine bias. And so they tend to be a bit slower in sorting salary with career, for example, when it's paired with female than it's when it's paired with male. Similarly, when you're looking at implicit racial bias, there are certain things that individuals need to do, like sort images. So here is an image of an African American face, and do they sort it to the left or the right side of the screen? And when it's African American or good is here and European American or bad is there, how does that impact how quickly they sort the faces versus when you have European American and good paired together and African American or bad paired together? And the idea is that the longer it takes to sort, the less likely that that's an automatic implicit association. And the quicker it's sorted, the more likely it is sort of this automatic implicit association. I hope that makes sense to you all. And when individuals are completing these measures, the researchers don't inform them of what is being assessed, nor do they request self-reports, as they do as with measures of explicit bias. But these scores can be predictive actually of things. So hiring managers whose scores on this task indicated that they had a gender bias, they tended to favor men over women in their hiring decisions. So they have some predictive value. And I want to say that I'm talking about these tasks primarily with adults, but these have actually also been used with children as young as 6 years of age, and they tend to show similar responses as adults. So implicit biases are developing fairly quickly. I see a yes, please. Is that in relation to explaining this further? Just want to. No. Okay. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about why we might have implicit biases. And I want to just say that there's still research really needed to understand this part, the why part. But there's some notion that that they might be from very early experiences. So humans, right, including infants and children, they're very good at detecting correlations in their environment. So one theory is that positive attitudes become associated with the gender and race with which infants and children are most familiar. And at least in the United States, and I will say in many other countries in the world, women tend to be the primary caregiver. And so that would be one way that warmth and nurturing tends to become associated with female faces relative to male faces, where male caregivers are less common. And these associations can be there early on, but then starting around 4 to 5 years of age, children start to understand social status, social power, wealth, and all that. And then that can affect their implicit bias associations. So if a child starts to learn that their race or ethnicity isn't as valued in a culture, that can affect then their implicit biases. There's also some interesting work showing a relation between how we recognize faces and implicit biases. So I don't know how many of you ever heard of the term the other race effect, but what this refers to is that individuals often have more difficulty recognizing faces from racial groups other than their own or racial groups with which they're familiar. And simply that they just have more difficult individuating those faces and then recalling them later. And I will tell you that this is an effect that's been found in many, many studies. It's a robust finding. And what they found is that more difficulty in individuating faces from other racial groups is linked to higher levels of implicit bias. And so there's been some interesting studies done, though, to help overcome the other race effect. And so, for example, in this study, there were white participants, and they were exposed to, in this one scenario, African-American male faces and Asian-American male faces. And with the case of the African-American male faces, they were trained to individuate them. The A was assigned as the label for this face, S was assigned for the label for that face, and D was assigned for the label for that face. But as you can see with the Asian American males, they all have the same letter assigned to them. So there isn't an individuation of them. It's more like a categorization of them. And once individuals learn to individuate faces, they actually show a decrease in their implicit bias. And the idea is that thinking about someone as an individual rather than a category member can help reduce these automatic associations and implicit bias. And this has not only been done with adults, but there's also studies with preschoolers also showing that they reduce their implicit bias once they've been able to train to individuate faces from other racial groups. So again, there's something about learning to think of someone as an individual versus a category group member. All right, so I'm going to transition now to talking about the workplace and the biases that are evident in the workplace. And I'm just going to start off by talking about another study that was conducted. In this study, the participants saw women or men in high authority roles such as doctor, professor, judge, scientist, or they saw them in low authority roles such as a cook, a nurse, a model, or a waiter. And then after they saw in one of those, conditions, those faces and individuals, then they had to code adjectives as good or bad. And some of the adjectives they had to code were things like clear, competent, bitter, annoying. And what they found is that after individuals saw women in high authority roles, this actually facilitated more negative than positive thinking. In other words, after seeing women in high authority roles, individuals were quicker at coding bad adjectives. And I will say that these same differences were not present after seeing men in high authority roles or seeing any of the individuals in the low authority roles. It was just for those in the condition with the women in higher authority roles. And so even though there are anti-discrimination laws now and overt forms of bias have been reduced, this automatic negative bias that a lot of individuals show toward women in power is a real problem for women in the workplace. There's a lot of ways that these biases can prevent women's progression. So biases are descriptive, what women are like, and prescriptive, how women should or should not behave. And so the communal traits, for which women are so positively valued, right, are an essential part of their shoulds, right? They should be warm, they should be friendly. And the agentic traits valued in men are should nots for women. So being masculine and powerful. And top management and executive level jobs are usually considered to be male, and they're described predominantly by masculine attributes such as achievement-oriented, aggressive, emotionally tough. So there's this lack of fit between these biased associations with women and the expectations for a leadership position. And this impacts women. So even though women are more likely than men to actually make a short list for a stereotypically masculine job, they're less likely to be hired for that job than men. And the same applies to individuals from minority racial groups. So what this means is that these description-based biases affect employee selection. They're making the shortlist, but they're not ending up getting hired. Now, what about if a woman actually did successfully get that power position? That's great, right? But then you say, but now she's in this position and her success at this male sex type job now means that they're perceived to have attributes necessary, right, to execute these tasks, and they have the responsibilities, required to fulfill that job. And so it eradicates like any, perceived lack of fit with that position. But now their actual success is a violation of these prescriptive norms, right? How women should or should not behave, right? If they're acting tough, showing power, and this bad fit with these norms and how maybe a woman in a leadership role is behaving can lead to less favorable evaluations, meaning that they may not then proceed up the corporate ladder. There's other consequences as well in the workplace. So a lot of women's performance can be devalued even when they are producing identical work or exhibiting similar behaviors as men. A woman's work is still often considered inferior to a man's work, and especially if the person evaluating her has strong biases. So you could see two individuals engage in the same thing. So here we have a woman on the phone, a man on the phone. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Let me go back. And for a woman, frequent phone conversations could be, decided that, oh, well, this is slacking off for a woman, but it's being productive for a man. Okay, so it's the same behavior, but then it's judged differently. Or if one of these individuals is waiting to make a decision, it might say, oh, the woman is being passive about this, where, oh, this is very prudent for the man. So again, same behaviors, but interpreted differently. And 3 decades of data show that women with the same level of performance as men less often received similar pay and promotions, especially when they were in those prestigious, highly educated occupations, the professional ones like doctors and lawyers. And even when women received higher performance ratings, their ratings of promotion potential still favored men. So across a number of occupational samples, gender differences favoring men in pay were almost 14 times larger than the gender differences in their performance evaluations. So even when they're getting rated similarly, men are still getting higher pay than women. Okay, so I've been talking about gender biases in the workplace, but I also want to talk about some of the impacts of racial biases. So, oops, I went ahead again. Sorry. So individuals can experience negative treatment if they are a minority group member. So for example, their ideas might be ignored, they may be ridiculed. At the office, they might form work groups based on race. And so instead of integrating employees, they are segregated. They might require minority applicants to have higher qualifications for jobs once occupied by less qualified white people. You could see people awarding minority senior positions, but then giving them lower salaries, fewer benefits, or less responsibility. So this negative treatment can manifest in several different forms. There's also something known as expectancy confirmation that can occur in the workplace. So a person's negative biases affect their expectations of and their behaviors toward minorities. And this can negatively impact the person being targeted. And what that means is that the target can sometimes behave in a way then that conforms to the stereotype. This is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy type of thing. And even without experiencing discrimination, racial minorities are well aware of cultural biases and stereotypes, and they may engage in stereotypic behavior if something about the situation triggers the stereotype. So for example, being outnumbered by members of non-stigmatized groups, for example, could be a scenario in which that occurs. So given these experiences, individuals from minority racial groups really worry about being judged based on their race rather than their individual attributes. And these concerns can create anxiety. They can lead to physiological stress responses, can lead to increased monitoring of their performance and the situation at hand. And they also have to regulate their negative thoughts and emotions that they're experiencing. And as you can imagine, that can be overwhelming. And as such, these can consume cognitive resources that should be used for work tasks, but instead they're dealing with all this racial issues, and this can affect both their working memory and job performance. Additional consequences are that for those who are targets of bias, they tend to show lower implicit self-esteem. So kind of like the implicit attitude task I showed earlier where there was sorting of words, when they have to do an implicit task like that where they're sorting words with me and other, we tend to see lowered self-esteem in those types of tasks. But when they explicitly report their self-esteem, we don't see a difference. So it's just the implicit self-esteem that is lowered in this case. And this can put them at risk for mental and physical health problems such as depression, hypertension, coronary heart disease, stroke, and all of which obviously physical and mental health problems can affect performance. Now, I do want to note, I've been talking about predominantly targets of bias, but I do want to say that there's actually data showing that for those who harbor implicit bias, they tend to have higher death rates, shorter lifespans. So let's just say bias isn't good for anybody, right? So I just want to give you some examples of how bias can manifest in the workplace. And I won't read all these examples out loud, but you can see biases based on gender, based on, ethnic familiarity, English language, race, attractiveness. And these affect workplace policies, they affect hiring, and they affect office interactions. And so they can occur at so many different levels in the workplace. So it's important to be aware of how these can manifest and how they can impact others. Okay, so I've been talking about negative outcomes of bias, but what I want to do now is talk a little bit about why you'd want to promote diversity in the workplace and why it's important. So we know that social diversity in a group can cause some discomfort. The interactions can be somewhat rougher, especially if individuals aren't used to a more diverse environment. There can sometimes be a lack of trust. There can sometimes be greater perceived interpersonal conflict, lower, communication, concerns about disrespect. But the data show that it can change the way you think and lead to new discoveries and breakthrough innovations. And so these innovations can occur not only because people with different backgrounds bring new information, but it's also because when we interact with individuals who are different, it forces group members to prepare better. They're anticipating, I'm going to get to this meeting, and because everyone's from different backgrounds, I'm going to expect there's going to be some alternative viewpoints, and reaching a consensus might require more effort. And so they prepare more. And as such, they come up with more innovative ideas. And so I think this is just really fascinating research. So just to give you an example, researchers who examined the relation between gender composition of a firm's top management teams and the firm's financial performance found that on average, female representation in top management led to an increase of $42 million in firm value. Those are not small numbers, right? That's impressive. They also measured the firm's innovation intensity through the ratio of research and development expenses to assets. And they found that companies that prioritized innovation saw greater financial gains when women were part of the top leadership ranks. And other research surveyed executives at 177 national banks in the US, and then put together a database comparing financial performance, racial diversity, and the emphasis the bank presidents put on innovation. And for innovation-focused banks, increases in racial diversity were related to enhanced financial performance. And I want to just tell you that these results regarding innovativeness, they've been found among jurors, scientists, college students, banks, management teams, and other global businesses. So this innovativeness with diverse groups carries across a number of scenarios and situations. And despite the bottom line, right, or in addition to the bottom line, valuing diversity can make individuals feel as if they belong, even if they are in the minority, and that's really important. So what can you do, right? I've just talked to you about all these issues in the workplace that can occur due to bias. So some companies have provided implicit bias training to their employees. And the main goal of implicit bias training is to help raise awareness of it and to try and reduce stigma and learn strategies to reduce biases as well. Now, it's most ideally conducted in person and an encouraging discussion of all participants, and it should provide a safe place for people to realize what biases they have and have and understand the real life consequences of biases and consider situations from different perspectives. Now, I'm going to say too, though, that implicit bias training is still controversial in the field. It seems to be effective sometimes and sometimes not others. And it could be because there's a lot of disparity in how it is conveyed in the scenarios, but it's one step that has been taken to try and help reduce bias. The other thing is I talked about sort of the idea of hiring and how our biases can affect hiring decisions. So one thing that's important to do is to prepare interview questions in advance. So recruiters really need to rely on structured interviews, meaning that the employers will write down a set of questions that they use for all applicants for a given position. And what the recruiter should do is agree on a set of criteria for a job prior to the hiring process and focus on job fit questions. What are your previous experiences managing employees? What important qualities make you a good candidate for this job? And why is this important? This is important because what can happen is bias can affect our thinking and affect what we think we should ask someone after seeing a name maybe indicating a person's ethnicity or gender. So just to give you an example, there was a study conducted in Sweden where professional recruiters, they showed that these professional recruiters created more questions about culture, such as an individual's cultural understanding, moral attitudes and values, and their group compatibility, like do you work well in groups, when they prepared to interview applicants with Arabic sounding names, compared to when they interviewed candidates with Swedish sounding names. And when a candidate had a Swedish sounding name, they developed more questions about a person's fit for the particular job. And obviously asking job fit questions are going to then give that person an advantage. So everyone should be asked the same questions and they shouldn't be altered based on their gender or background. And I just want to say, these differences in asking questions could also occur in response to preparing to interview female and male applicants. They should all be asked the same questions. The other thing is we talked about evaluations and how those can be problematic. And one of the reasons they can be problematic is what happens if you have sort of these evaluation scales that can be shifting standards. And so in this case, like there's stereotypes that men are more athletic than women. And then an individual here is like, well, Mary went for a jog yesterday and Mark went for a jog yesterday. Now, they say, how athletic are these individuals? And what you can see is that Mary has almost a 6 here, whereas Mark only got a 5. But because women aren't that athletic, it's like, oh, she went for a jog, so she's kind of athletic. Whereas they expect men to be athletic, so they get slightly lower. But in the long run, they still think that Mark's more athletic than Mary, if that makes any sense. So the idea is that we make judgments with reference to sort of these within category standards. So comparing the leadership ability of a particular woman to lower standards for women can be problematic as compared to the high standards of competence that are often set out for men. And unfortunately, employers will subjectively evaluate women more positively than men, praise their successful performance because it doesn't align with their implicit bias, but then men still tend to get more promotions and pay raises. And the same applies to individuals from minority groups. So what you can do then is make sure that the scales being used to evaluate individuals are not like this 1 to 5, and they're not subjective, like, yeah, I think you're a good salesperson, I'm gonna give you a 4. You wanna use something much more objective, like, okay, as a salesperson, what were the amount of sales you had this quarter? How many new clients did you bring in? And then that is a much more objective measure versus, hey, you're a pretty good salesperson, right? So the idea is you have standard criteria on which everyone are evaluated to avoid these subjective evaluations. And that is the end of my part of the presentation, and I'm going to let my colleague, Dr. Nelson, take over.
Needed to unmute there before I shared. Okay. Slideshow. Here we go. Okay, so thank you for the transition there. And that was a wonderful introduction and overview to, what implicit bias is and its impacts and what we can do. And I want to, just for these last 10 minutes or so before we open it up for Q&A, to take a little bit of a reflective stance here. Some of this might be a little bit meta in terms of, what happens when we go through a training like this, implicit bias training. And as Dr. Reynolds said, a real key goal is to become more aware of our own biases and to also reduce stigma associated with stereotypes and such. And so ideally, right, we would want this greater awareness to lead to personal behavioral change. So I actually go through this training, and then I am less biased when I am hiring people, for example, or when I'm giving individuals opportunities to do something. I'll be less biased in that fashion. But also, we might see in some cases and hope that we become more aware when we notice biases, implicit biases that are coming out sometimes in the form of microaggressions. Again, when we think about implicit bias, we're not speaking about intentional, planned out kinds of behaviors. These are spontaneous in the moment. And so I do want to make a distinction here in terms of trying to help create change in the culture or the environment by what we might call calling out when other people engage in these biases versus calling in. And the literature just recently has made a distinction on this. Calling out usually happens in more public spaces, say like a faculty meeting or a lab meeting where somebody says or does something and another person vocalizes this verbally in a way to draw attention to it and to try to help avoid that behavior in the future. And oftentimes this kind of public calling out often also kind of emphasizes the agency and the autonomy of the person who's doing the calling out. And this is in contrast to calling in, which typically happens more in private settings. For example, maybe after this has occurred in public, and then an individual goes and confronts the person who expressed this bias and does so in a way that is often viewed as more accommodating. So it's less directive, less challenging in that way. And both of these have been viewed empirically to be effective in changing behavior, but they can be initiated by people based on differences in one's personality. If one is particularly agreeable, maybe calling in is seen as a more attractive option to creating this kind of personal change of another individual through this conversation separately, right, one-on-one, versus doing it in a public way. But we also see here in terms of power dynamics that sometimes it can be very empowering for individuals who have historically been those who have experienced discrimination and prejudice and implicit bias, as Dr. Reynolds mentioned earlier in her talk here. And in that case, doing this in a public way can be a way to really reaffirm oneself and push back against those types of things. But in a reflective way here, I want to say is that unfortunately, some of the literature suggests that doing implicit bias training is not necessarily all that effective in creating this kind of change, and that shouldn't necessarily be surprising to us because we do know that these implicit biases are developed or learned at a very young age. There is evidence to suggest they might occur really before we have a grasp of language. So they might be encoded, looking at nonverbal behavior, how our caregivers are responding to demonstrate comfort around other people and objects, or how they might demonstrate fear or anxiety. And as a result of that, going to a training like this and learning about it can be really interesting, but can it actually change your behavior given that these biases might be kind of embedded in you in a way that is less sensitive to talking about these things, learning cognitively about them? And the other addition here is that, as we learned earlier, is that implicit biases are really about spontaneous behavior. So learning and reflecting on our own biases can help alter our planned intentional behavior. But in that moment, when something happens, we see somebody, we get a gut feeling, things of this nature occur, then oftentimes we still act in these biased ways. So another thing I want to mention here is that, especially from a leadership perspective, like talking about biases, we very often see defensiveness around these kinds of claims that, especially from members of dominant groups, I am one of those as a white male, that I might feel threatened by this discussion that I might have biases against women or biases against individuals of color. And I might want to protect myself and say that that's not true. What is really the evidence that the implicit association test predicts behavior? Questions like this, right? And there's a lot of very rigorous critical work exploring those ideas. But one of the things that we see that's helpful in overcoming defensiveness just recently here, I want to skip over here to emotional ambivalence. Emotional ambivalence, this is a phenomenon that it turns out when an individual is learning about implicit bias, if they have both positive and negative feelings, about this information, that they are biased. So negative in the sense that maybe I've harmed people or hurt people, or I've contributed to institutional structural differences, access to resources, all those kinds of big narrative things, right, that we might think about. But if I also have positive feelings around how learning about this might help me be able to make changes and have an impact in the world, that kind of emotional ambivalence in the present moment of learning about implicit biases actually attenuates, it reduces defensiveness, and is associated with implicit bias training being much more effective in creating change. However, right, from a leadership perspective, again, though, how would I be able to like change people's emotional reaction to be more ambivalent, not just defensive in this kind of way? And one thing that we see in the literature is, especially again for dominant group members, that actually having those individuals think about positive attributes associated with their group before talking about these things that are associated with negative bias that have often been expressed by those members of dominant groups, that kind of priming of positive emotionality actually creates more of this emotional ambivalence, so that trainings are more effective in creating change. The other thing, though, that I want to mention here is that a lot of the literature on implicit bias training suggests that it's not about personal change. It's not about changing other people one-on-one. That really what we want to do to create an impact through implicit bias training is to engage this at a more structural level. And so this could include things like a department or a lab or a group trying to create policies that create more equity, as well as creating changes in the way in which individuals are given access to participating in different kinds of decision-oriented meetings, right? And as well as providing exposure to real lived counterexamples to those stereotypes that Dr. Reynolds talked about earlier. So I want to just in a couple of quick minutes give what I think is somewhat maybe of an example of this in the psychology department here at UNLV. And for many years, UNLV's psychology department has had a mentoring program where graduate students in a one-on-one way mentor psychology majors from a underrepresented or marginalized group. That could involve individuals of color or first generation college students, sexual minorities, really broadly defined. And we also provided like workshop events for career and graduate school, things like that. But when we look at this, which is it's a helpful thing to do, it also kind of reflects some underlying stereotypes that might be implicitly held by members of our community, which is that individuals who are coming in as a psychology major from one of these marginalized or underrepresented groups really have to be helped by people who are in expert positions. And historically, a lot of those graduate students were dominant members of the psychology field. The faculty involved are members of dominant fields, right? So this is suggesting that there is this need that students in these groups, undergraduates, cannot really do this on their own without extra help. And so what we did over the past several years is that we created an advisory board creating structural change to try to push back against these kinds of stereotypes, where we brought in members of the group who were undergraduates to actually lead the program. And this resulted in greater funding, an enlargement of the program itself. They identified that the group needed more social support events, more kinds of fun events too, like celebrating different kinds of holidays. And these are kinds of things that we probably wouldn't have known if we didn't create this leadership board. And another thing that we found is that these individuals.
You okay, baby?
Hmm?
Very successful in
Really needed access to research opportunities. And so we actually created a separate research group associated with OOMP, where students could create their own research project, identify what it is that they wanted to do, and learn how to engage in those research skills. And this has resulted in several national conference presentations by these students, as well as just now a written paper that is going out for publication. So in this sense, right, when we think about, implicit bias, what do we do? How do we respond in a way? And a lot of the really current research is suggesting we need to respond in structural ways, making interventions that demonstrate valuing diversity, that give individuals opportunities to demonstrate the variety of their skills and capacities, to show everyone and provide everyone new experiences that go against these early developed biases. And so I will go ahead and end at that point. And I think we would like to spend the last few minutes opening it up for a Q&A.
So I think while others might be thinking about their questions, I just wanted to ask if we could actually share the presentation slides with participants, because I know that we had few questions regarding that. So I was wondering if that could be shared with me so I can send it to them later.
Yes, I think we can do that.
Perfect. Thank
Is
you.
that okay?
That's no problem. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. Yeah, that's not a problem at all.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No questions on implicit bias. Well, I really find implicit bias to be a really big challenge, right? If this thing does exist, which the literature suggests it does, right? How do we intervene around something that we're unconscious and unaware of? So in that sense, it's a real challenge, and I hope though that coming to this, that many of you will kind of reflect on it and think about like what are creative, innovative ways in which we might help change the conditions in which we're living so that we have less of this passed down. Like what Dr. Reynolds was talking about, at a very early age, we develop these. If we have fewer biased experiences when we're young, hopefully we will have less of this that we'll have to combat once we're adults and in the professional world.
And I think it's also it can be a very individual process where you are kind of, once you become sort of aware of it and maybe start thinking about it, and sometimes because they're automatic associations, maybe later on you go, oh, I acted that way because of X, right? And so there's your own reflections, but I also think it's good, as Paul was talking about, to be within groups that, like our department made a concerted effort to start really working towards inclusion, diversity, equity, and it was during the pandemic when everyone needed some sort of support extra. And we had some very real and sometimes difficult conversations, but those have resulted in some meaningful changes. And I think that that's really important. And so it does take work. And I think it takes work at both the individual as well as the structural levels. And obviously you want people on board, but if you want to have a group where everyone feels included, and like I said earlier, the diversity leads to innovativeness, and that's really what puts us forward business-wise. So anyway, I just kind of want to throw that out there. And sometimes it is uncomfortable asking for a change, but it can pay off if your group is willing to work with you, or your job or employer.
And I see a question, Dr. Reynolds. I don't know if you have any understanding of this about technology, the way technology has influenced bias and implicit bias. A lot of the psychology literature that's really starting to look at social media, sadly, on some level, finds that we manifest what we do interpersonally in these social media technology spaces. But there are some things, for example, around ability versus disability that social media and technology interventions have allowed more access and opportunity to express oneself in a way where you are not overtly identified as having that type of stereotyped disability. And so we do see some positives there in terms of helping to, again, create these new experiences that challenge old conceptions, old stereotypes.
And I'm going to be blatantly honest, I am not on social media at all. But I taught a seminar on promoting social justice through psychology, and a lot of my students talked about how social media can either make people feel included or highly excluded. And so I think it has both its pros and cons that way. We've seen a lot of divisiveness on social media sometimes, but then we also see groups coming together. And so, yeah, my general gist is that there's both pros and cons to technology in that regard.
Well, if there are no further questions, should we call an end to our training today?
Yeah, sure. I think we don't have any more questions. So before we end today's session, we would like to thank our presenters for sharing their time and expertise with us today, and to thank our participants for joining us today. Before you all log off, please take a few minutes to fill out this workshop feedback survey we dropped in the chat. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, everyone.